At the beginning of the 1970s, Foucault declared himself a follower of the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. I call this his Nietzschean turn. He had admired Nietzsche for a long time. He reports that he started reading Nietzsche in 1952 or 1953. It appears that he admired Nietzsche and identified with him even before he started reading him. In retrospect, in an interview given in 1980, Foucault said that when he briefly became a member of the Communist Party in 1950-53, it was not because he had Marxist sentiments, it was because he had Nietzschean sentiments. Nietzsche and Georges Bataille, the experimental novelist, were the means of access that led him to communism. Communism, he understood, as another form of rejection of the world we're living in, another form of revolt against the hypocrisy of the world we see around us. And if Nietzsche was against everything and the communists were against everything and they all wanted to change the world and start over, then he was a communist. Of course, it was ridiculous to be a Nietzschean communist, and he understood that later, but he said nevertheless in his youth he was one. His biographer, however, at least one of his biographers, Didier Eribon, doesn't believe this interpretation Foucault gives of his own past. According to Eribon, he really was a Marxist for a while and then changed his mind and became a Nietzschean later. But Foucault reports that when he did read Nietzsche, actually read him apart from identifying with him from a few snippets and a general sense of who he was, when he read Nietzsche, he read him with a passion that changed his life. He had felt trapped, and after reading Nietzsche, he felt free. Nietzsche helped him feel that he could escape and change his life, and he did. He quit his job, and he left France. And he says he did that because of the inspiration that Nietzsche gave him. Foucault came to believe that there was no single philosophy to be found in the works of Nietzsche, but rather a series of somewhat disparate ideas that subsequent thinkers could draw on and develop, and that's what he did. He drew on Nietzsche. He declared himself a follower in the sense that he drew on him, not in the sense that he agreed with everything he wrote, or not in the sense that he believed everything he wrote was consistent with the other things he wrote. So he came to rely on them. This is my thesis, but not only my thesis. He came on rely on particularly Nietzsche's notion of will to power and power as to resolve the dilemma that he faced regarding causality in history. From now on, roughly from an essay he wrote on Nietzsche about then, published in 71, Foucault would be free of what Dreyfus and Ravenel call the illusion of autonomous discourse. He'd never, that is to say, the idea that language is sort of self-contained and just autonomously functions as a sphere of its own. He'd never completely fallen into the illusion of autonomous discourse. He sometimes seemed to say that language creates the world and everything that's in it, but he never literally accepted the absurd consequences that would follow from such a proposition taken literally. Now he found a way to talk about the world outside language. See, he used to seem to say there was no world outside language, and that was a bit embarrassing. It seemed to mean there were no causes and effects. But now he has a way to talk about the world outside language. And he found a way to do that that let him avoid the materialism and the naturalism that he wanted to avoid. There would be something outside discourse that determines what discourse will be, and what it will be is power. This is where power enters Foucault's philosophy. Formerly, when Foucault wrote what he called archaeologies in The Order of Things and elsewhere, he was writing about the cultural codes governing knowledge in European modernity, putting the objects of knowledge as distinct from the forms of knowledge at a distance. He was talking about the codes, the forms, putting at some distance, what are the objects? What, after all, are we talking about when we see it through the lenses of all these codes? And he seemed to say that the codes form the objects. The discourse creates its own objects. But henceforth, as Foucault writes what he now calls genealogies, he now starts to call his writing genealogy. He borrowed the term from Nietzsche, who wrote a famous book called The Genealogy of Morals. Now the way he writes social history will be organized around the objects he studies, or the ways in which power is exercised. There will be an outside to language, and what will be outside language will be force or power. Citing Deleuze, who was at the time a great admirer of Foucault. Jürgen Habermas makes what I take to be the same point in slightly different terms. Habermas says that in the order of things, Foucault had led himself and his readers to the strange result that regularities regulate themselves. Foucault escapes this difficulty, says Habermas, by giving up the autonomy of knowledge. And he finds the foundation of knowledge in power. Power becomes something that determines knowledge. It doesn't just, they're not just sort of self-governing codes. So power, this term with so many meanings that over the years Foucault came to employ in unusual and controversial ways, power became available as Foucault tried to provide plausible causal explanations concerning why, over time, some discourses burgeon while other discourses wither away and disappear. I must say, however, that the word causal is really more at home in my vocabulary than in his, since in spite of his declaration in 1969 that he would look into it, he's continued to shy away from it. Indeed, in 1980, he said he had been misunderstood or had failed to explain himself if power were taken to explain. Power is, he then says, in 1980, not what explains, but what needs to be explained. That's 1980. We're talking 1970. I think Habermas and Hanneth and Dreyfus and Rabenau are right to saying that in the 1970s this was a way out of the sort of implausible consequences of the sort of cultural codes sort of determining knowledge in the order of things. And what you can do with power is you can avoid reducing the social to the natural. That is, we can talk about social conflicts or social struggles, power struggles, that can explain how some discourses or ways of talking tend to triumph and prosper and win, while others tend to be defeated epistemologies that fade away and are forgotten discourses. But you can do this in a Nietzschean way, focusing on will to power, without seeing nature as a realm of laws. Remember that Kant saw nature as a realm of laws, and then he saw social life also as a realm of laws. Remember the human subject, the rational entity, is able to give itself laws. Now what happens with the Nietzschean turn of Foucault? Now we can see nature as a realm of power whose social parallel is also power. But this doesn't mean, it didn't mean for Nietzsche, it doesn't mean for Foucault, that the principles of physics and chemistry and the other advanced natural sciences are entirely determined by social struggles for power. Foucault also thinks linguistics is an advanced science. Foucault was saved from being committed to this implausible proposition because he now specifies that what he's talking about is savoir. It's no longer appropriate. It's no longer appropriate from this time on to translate Foucault when he says savoir as knowledge. What he refers to, starting about 1970, as savoir is the particular sorts of knowledge that he finds in the rather dubious human sciences, such as economics and psychiatry, which Foucault particularly studies. I'm quoting Foucault, between opinion, mere opinion, and scientific knowledge, one can recognize the existence of a particular level which I propose to call that of savoir. The savoir is not embedded only in theoretical texts and research instruments, but in a whole set of practices. So he wants to see psychiatry not just as some rather dubious kind of knowledge, but as a whole set of practices and institutions, discourses that go in with practices. So with respect to savoir, social struggles for power generally are constitutive in the historical evolution of concepts. Social struggles are, however, not completely without influence, even when we're talking about physics and biology and linguistics, the so-called sort of hard sciences. So Foucault's Nietzschean turn drew him closer to some kinds of Marxism and farther away from other kinds of Marxism. He drew closer to Marxism if that's thought of as a philosophy that exposes the falsity of bourgeois ideology and the power of class interests that drive the production of bourgeois ideology. Marx and Nietzsche can be interpreted as agreeing that social life consists of a series of conflicts in which the rules that govern the conflicts are made by the winners in their own interests and against the interest of the losers. Foucault came closer to those who create a pantheon in which Marx and Nietzsche and Freud are in the Hall of Fame as great thinkers who unmask the hypocrisy of the established society. Some people also add Karl Mannheim to that Hall of Fame. Mannheim was the founder of the sociology of knowledge, which studies the biases that are introduced into knowledge by the social conditions of the production of knowledge. So Marxists, looked at in this respect, are distinguished by what they don't believe. They don't believe in capitalism. They don't believe in bourgeois ideals. They don't believe in property in many cases, at least in the case of Engels, they don't believe in marriage. So they're classed together with others who are also distinguished by what they don't believe. So Marx is drafted to be a combatant in the attack on common sense. All right. So this Nietzschean turn, however, drew Foucault even farther away than he already was from the sort of thing Paul Ricoeur called a second innocence. That is to say, from those who find in some religious and communitarian folk traditions cultural resources that function to improve the material conditions of life. And he was away, he became farther away from those who find ideas like moral economy. And this is something found in E.P. Thompson. For when E.P. Thompson writes the history of the working class in England, he stresses the influence of John Ruskin and the sort of moral position of people who believe in a better life for everybody, who believe that the wages ought to be raised, that there ought to be Social Security. And Thompson finds that in the growth of the solidarity of the British working class, there was a strong influence of writers who made a moral case for justice. So now Foucault is farther away from that sort of thing. He's away from many sort of cultural Marxists influenced by Gramsci, disregarding Gramsci's Leninism, who thought in terms of a gradual moral and intellectual reform, a long-term war of position in which shifting alliances and different educational strategies would eventually lead to a cultural advance toward solidarity and a raising of consciousness so that people wouldn't be their own enemies, sort of internalizing the oppressor. So Nietzsche also helped Foucault to advance his anti-humanist agenda without relying on structuralism. I'll try to explain why, and I'll add some remarks on what's at stake. To the extent that it's persuasive, Foucault's dissolution of the human subject, whether it's accomplished by structuralism, that emphasizes the system, or whether it's accomplished by alliance with the avant-garde literary people who emphasize dispersion, or by an alliance with Nietzsche, who emphasizes that the death of God entails the death of man. That is, when there's no divinity in the world, there's no spark of divinity in the human being either. Whichever way you get there, you effectively undermine not just the existentialist Marxism of Jean-Paul Sartre, but also any democratic ideology that proposes to extend freedom and rights, taking as a premise that humans have an essential dignity as rational beings. But Foucault's attack on liberal humanism does not so far dissolve social democracy if we think of it as Popper and Dewey think of it, as a never-ending perfecting of institutions to make them more effective in meeting everybody's needs. You see what I'm saying? I'm saying that if you think that the basis of social democracy is the concept of the dignity of the human being, which presupposes a concept of the human, then Foucault attacks that. But if you think of social democracy as a project for systematically improving institutions so they work better, it doesn't necessarily depend on human rights defined as the rights of a transcendental divine being called humanity, then Foucault's attack is ineffective. It doesn't touch it. In fact, you can read Foucault, at least at this point in his career, as helping the case for democratic socialism, because in the process of dissolving the ethical subject of Kantianism, that is the dissolving the system, the categorical imperative, and the sort of various notions of human dignity that come from Kant. Remember that Kant then deduces from these ethical notions a legal framework. So the legal framework of property and contract comes out of the same basic concepts which ultimately derive from the Critique of Pure Reason, where you sort of create a pure world of reason that has eternal principles. So you can see the dissolution of Kantian ethics as the dissolution of the Kantian theory of law, which is a dissolution of the civil code that governs commerce, and it's just that this commercial system that some socialists want to destroy, other socialists want to amend, improve, and transform. We're going to have to add some qualifications to this when we get to later Foucault, as he gave his lectures in the late 70s. So Foucault can be read as clearing the path for cultural creativity, for breaking down this sort of idea that civilization has been eternally defined by the human rights movement of the 18th century, and all we have to do is impose it on Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and the whole world will have the right concept. Foucault deconstructs that, so maybe that makes him progressive. But we need some qualifications. First, Foucault's anti-humanism does, in a way, it's intended to undermine Jean-Paul Sartre and democratic socialism conceived as a radical liberation of humanity. But whether these people are refuted depends a bit on whether they really care about this concept of humanity that Foucault has deconstructed. For example, people might read Sartre, or they might read Lakhan and Mouffe, the Argentine socialists who argue that we can start with democracy as a political idea, and therefore we should extend it to make it an economic idea. We should have democracy in the family. We sort of start with the partial concept of democracy, and then we extend it to get democracy more on a wider scale and more institutions. And Foucault might say, well, Lakhan and Mouffe, you guys are wrong because the whole idea depends on an idea of humanity. But Lakhan and Mouffe might reply, we don't care. You can keep your abstract idea of humanity. What we really want to do is accept the fact that democracy is now generally accepted as the right kind of politics. And given that, as a matter of fact, it's generally accepted, it logically implies economic democracy, democracy and human relationships generally. We don't need Kant, we don't need Jean-Jacques Rousseau to tell us what nature wants. We can just accept the fact that as a matter of the history of our times, democracy exists as an ideal most people believe in. But but Foucault has a counterattack. Like I can describe now. I can say, well, what Lakhan and Mouffe's position might be: we don't need no transcendentals. We can do our thing without any transcendental humanism. But Foucault has another line of argument, and he gets it from Nietzsche. Since Nietzsche, the role of philosopher can be thought of as, in a sense, as opening up new paths for thought, but it can also be thought of as an interpretation of culture. We can think of the philosopher as telling what's going on in our culture. And we can say that, well, what Nietzsche tells us as a sort of analyst or commentator or very perceptive observer of the culture around us is this is no longer really a religious culture. You know, maybe Europe used to be Christendom, but it's not anymore. So what's really happening is that God is dead. God doesn't really function in life anymore, and consequently humanity died. And if you this sort of Foucault, using basically Nietzschean ideas, can continue to say what he's been saying for various different reasons, that the powers that be and the bureaucracies of East and West, and charlatans like Albert Camus or Pierre Teilhard de Chardin or Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, all these people are sort of feeding on the corpse of a dead ideal of humanity. And he can, of course, the biggest frauds of all are Hegel and Marx, who are promoting things like liberation and emancipation. So we can say that we just make a commentary on culture by saying that in terms of really being effective, God is out. Therefore, any notions of humanity that pretend to be transcendental, that pretend to be divine, are also out. And in this case, Lakhan and Mouffe are attacked. It's not that they're two ships passed in the night, because he said, look, you guys, you're trying to build socialism on a culture that no longer exists. Or it doesn't, it's just a sort of leading a posthumous life. So the sort of sincere belief in democracy doesn't really exist, because it's just not where our culture is at. You might think, listening to the news, that most people believe in democracy, but they don't really. So my statement that Foucault's critique of humanism makes him an ally of realist social construction also requires some qualification. Remember, I said that he's an ally in the sense that when he deconstructs Kant's ethics, he also deconstructs Kant's jurisprudence by implication. But Foucault also has another strand, which we've been talking about, which is his literary strand. In the works of Maurice Blanchot, a French writer of fiction who influenced Foucault, what Foucault finds the invincible erosion of the person who speaks. See, we think of human beings as speakers, but no, says Foucault, at this stage of our culture now, and avant-garde writers like Blanchot make this explicit, we are losing this idea that there's a speaker who speaks. The language and discourse have a life quite independent, and the so-called subject is kind of a froth on the discourse. But when let me say I'm not convinced by this. If Foucault, as interpreted by Machery, takes this great insight from literary experience that the human subject is evolving, and he uses it in the social sciences, I think we can legitimately answer, well, that's not actually what's happening in the social sciences. It's true that there are elements of social science, and Foucault cites them, which can be interpreted as doing without the subject. But what about Jane Loevinger? Jane Loevinger is a social scientist, and she's developed this whole theory of ego development, building on Freud's idea of the ego as the integrating, what's the word, level of the personality. And what Loevinger and other investigators find is that ego development sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't. That some people score high, have a high level of ego development, they have a high level of integrated personality, and others score low. They don't have all that much of an integrated personality. So we can say, well, Foucault, you've just been talking about the people who score low on the various instruments that psychologists have invented to measure ego development. That doesn't mean that our whole culture is going for the disintegration of personalities. It just means that some personalities, the truth of the matter, as empirical investigation finds, is that some personalities are more integrated than others. So the integrating ego exists in varying degrees and in diverse ways in our culture and in others. You might say in Japan that it's not that there's not an ego, there's not an integration. It's just that in traditional Japanese culture, people relate to different people in different ways, so they don't, in a way, it's been said they don't have a single personality. They have different personalities depending on what social relationship they're in, or when they're in it. So Jacques Lacan, who Foucault cited Lacan as a person who had studied the unconscious, and when he looked into the unconscious minds and found out what people's inner souls are really like, all he found was language. He didn't find any inner souls. But Lacan does not agree with Foucault's interpretation of Lacan. I want to quote Lakhan now. Lacan says, I'd like to remark that with or without structuralism, there is nowhere any question in the field vaguely marked as structuralism of the negation of the subject. So Lacan, his witness, is letting him down. As a lawyer, I know what it's like when you call a witness to the stand. The witness doesn't say what you expect. Well, Lacan was supposed to agree with Foucault, but he doesn't. Lacan says, it was never a question of the negation of the subject. It is a matter of the dependence of the subject, which is extremely different, and particularly at the level of the return to Freud, of the dependence of the subject with respect to something truly elementary, which we have tried to isolate under the name signifier. So Foucault wants to run off with that and say, they're just signifiers, or free. Later people would say free-floating signifiers. There's no subject. But Lacan says, no, that's not what we mean. We're talking about there are subjects, but they depend on signifiers. So Foucault is an ally of the realist in that he shows that nothing social is fixed or eternal. He's not an ally of those who believe in choice and construction, insofar as he holds that willy-nilly we must accept a Nietzschean diagnosis of contemporary culture, whether we want to or not. He's not accurate to the extent that he underestimates the continuing vitality of humanistic ideals. Foucault recognizes where some key issues are. So in a way you can say that this is where Foucault got his research program that he carried out from 1970 on. The key issue is, how are subjects in fact constituted by modern society? So as Foucault tells us in his 1983 text in Berkeley, this question of power comes in as, what is the role of power in constituting subjects? So his further research from about 1970 on is not going to concentrate on causality, as he said it was. He's going to, I'm going to quote Foucault, he's going to do research on a history of different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subjects. So Nietzsche provides Foucault with a guiding concept, namely power, because it's going to be power which to a large extent is the way that subjects are formed. So in Kant's terms, the percepts gathered in Foucault's thousands of hours spent reading books in the libraries of Paris would have been blind. But now they're not blind, because there's a leading idea that different modes of way human beings are made subjects by power. So to say that Foucault took a Nietzschean turn is not to say that he thereafter described himself as simply a Nietzschean, or that he even found a single message in Nietzsche's writings. It is to say that thinking in terms of will to power enabled him thereafter to reframe epistemology in a different perspective. It was a perspective he wanted. Concerning Marxism, his Nietzschean turn enabled him to say that this is something that this is something Foucault says. What I want to say is what I'm about to quote from Foucault is something he couldn't have said before his Nietzschean turn. Foucault says that if you're one of these people who's trying to demonstrate that Marxism is a rational science, what you're really trying to do is give Marxism power. And then Foucault says that's something entirely different from trying to demonstrate that Marx's propositions are the outcome of verifiable procedures. In other words, these people are not really trying to show that with proper hard science we can prove that Marx's propositions are right. What they're trying to do is they're trying to give power to Marxism. That's the sort of thing that Foucault said, and which I think shows how his Nietzschean turn helped him to say what he wanted to say. His Nietzschean term also enables himself to, Foucault's Nietzschean term enables Foucault to transform himself several times. That is to say, he can now reinterpret his own past. He was an anti-Marxist in the order of knowledge, and then he became a radical fellow traveler of Marxists in the early 1970s, and then he became a radical non-Marxist a few years later, and then back to being a radical anti-Marxist a few years after that, this time with a more sophisticated discursive practice, which we'll talk about in later sessions. So by 1976, Foucault can refer to Marxism and psychoanalysis together as, quote, the enemy. Why are they the enemy? Because they're unitary theories. Remember that in the archaeology of knowledge, he was all for dispersion. And then when he takes his Nietzschean turn, he's even more for dispersion, because we're talking about knowledge as a play of power, which sort of makes the whole idea of a great theory a non-starter, because all of these people promoting knowledge, after all, are seeking their own power. So the whole sort of project of creating a great science of everything doesn't even enter into the game. But there's another thing that you can do with being a Nietzschean, and that is a Foucaultian, that is a Foucauldian Nietzschean, a person who follows Foucault and Nietzsche at the same time, can pass for a while among Marxist-Leninists as just another comrade. You say you're having a revolution in France, and you have a whole bunch of student revolutionaries, and all they want to hear is how we're going to bring down the system. Now, a Nietzschean Foucauldian can say, yes, comrades, it's all about the struggle. And then the Marxist-Leninists say, yes, that's right, right on, it's all about the struggle. And then the Foucauldian Nietzschean says, it's all about power. And the Marxist-Leninists say, yes, comrade, right on, it's all about power. Yes, comrades, this is Foucault speaking in my interpretation, the reason why the prison system arose when it did and as it did was that capitalism required it at a certain moment in history. Okay, right on, say the comrades. And then we can say, and this is, this sort of thing Foucault actually did say, yes, comrades, there's nothing more despicable than a reformist, nothing more despicable than a humanist, nothing more despicable than a social pacifist or a class collaborationist. And at this point, you can't tell the difference between a Nietzschean Foucaultian and a Marxist-Leninist. But it turns out that in the end, the Nietzschean Foucaultian discourse is not Marxist-Leninist at all. It locates itself to the left of the Marxist-Leninists, at least in a certain period of Foucault's radicalism. The Soviet Union is just one more bourgeois state. Foucault in his radical period works with the Maoists, although nobody really knows what relationship the French people who called them Maoists had to do with the ones in China, but they called themselves Maoists. The labor unions are conservative organizations. Nothing to do with them. The Communist Party is a conservative party. Nothing to do with them. So this conceptual move of becoming a Nietzschean makes it possible to chime in with the most radical of the radicals, and nevertheless to locate oneself to the left of them by replacing humanist ideals with power. This became abundantly clear in a famous debate that was held on television in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands state television had a debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault. And in this debate, Foucault insisted that the proletariat is not fighting for justice. The proletariat is simply fighting to win. And Chomsky didn't know quite what to make of this, because Chomsky really thought that the cause of the working class was the cause of justice. But over and over Foucault said, no, it's not the cause of justice. It's simply a struggle for power. But it follows from this Nietzschean premise that it may be true that the working class is fighting for power, but the capitalist class is also fighting for power. Or the rentier class, the people who live on their investments and don't do any work at all, they're fighting for power too. Or the colonels who take over some country in South America or Africa, they're also fighting for power. Anybody who fights is also fighting to win, and nobody has more of a right to win than anybody else. So the Nietzschean turn served to dissolve the traditional arguments that reformers had made in favor of social justice, and to reinforce the Sophist proposition that might makes right. If you've read Plato's dialogues, you remember that there are a series of dialogues in which the Sophists argue against Socrates, who's sort of the mouthpiece of Plato, and Socrates is always arguing for justice, and the Sophists are always saying justice is simply the interest of the stronger. It's just whoever wins, that's justice. Well, Foucault says, I'm quoting Foucault, Foucault says in 1974, I am radically on the side of the Sophists. So what happens, and we'll go into a little more detail in the next time, that capitalism, which had been sort of named as the enemy, is renamed and generalized as power. So power becomes the enemy, and capitalism then becomes just one form of power among others, and then in a further development, after that, it turns out power is not bad at all. It's just what is. And exercising power gives people pleasure. Power is creative. So power starts out being a solution to how do you avoid the illusion of autonomous discourse by having something outside language. It becomes the generalized enemy, and then it later becomes something which is not bad. It has good, it's productive, it has a whole series of, these are all some of the permutations that power goes through during the 1970s in Foucault's work. So I don't think Foucault is consistent. Foucault sometimes comes to the conclusion that it doesn't matter what side you're on. But let me do a flash forward a bit to 1982. I want to quote a friend of Foucault's named Paul Vane. Paul Vane was hanging out with Foucault in his apartment one day in 1983. And Foucault and Paul Vane were in Foucault's apartment in Paris, and they were watching TV. So I'm quoting Paul Vane. He says, well, we were watching a televised report on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. At one point, one of the combatants, doesn't matter which side he was on, was invited to speak. Now this man spoke on TV. What this man said was, I know only one thing. I want to win back the lands of my forefathers. That's what I've wanted since my teens. I don't know where this passion comes from, but there it is. Now Vane says, Foucault said, there we have it at last, Foucault said. Everything has been said, and there's nothing more to say. So each valorization, and you see, the point is, it doesn't matter whether it's the Palestinian or the Israeli, whichever side it was, there's nothing more to say, says Foucault. They're just after power. And they just have a passion that is, well, that's the way it is. Humans have passions for will to power. So each valorization of the will to power, or each discursive practice, is a prisoner of itself. I'm still quoting Vane. And universal history is woven of nothing but such threads. Well, we don't know what Nietzsche would have thought if he'd lived on into the 21st century about proposals like my proposal to reduce dependence on the logic of capital accumulation by organizing nations and local communities with different rules, such as, for example, the 3 principles of permaculture, quoting Bill Mollison: love the earth, love its people, share the surplus. But we might read Nietzsche, in fact many people do read Nietzsche, as saying, I must be wrong. Or anybody who sort of thinks along these lines must be completely wrong. You can't solve problems by establishing better rules and better institutions, because rules and institutions are made by power. They don't make power. Power makes them. Since power causes not just rules, but all other phenomena, people like me are irrelevant. We're whistling in the dark. Most likely, besides being irrelevant, I'm also probably driven by will to power like everyone else. Most likely, I'm not really interested in solving humanity's problems at all. My will to power just happens to adopt the subtle form of pretending to want to contribute to solving the problems of life. So I consider this what I take the liberty of calling a Nietzschean objection to building non-authoritarian cultures of solidarity by cooperating to solve physical and emotional problems. I consider this in several ways, not just in these lectures, but also in other writings. So in the next of this series, I'm going to comment more on power talk and what power talk is doing in the discourse of Foucault in the 1970s and in the discourse of Nietzsche.